Hello and welcome to ANR News. This is our report. I'm Ryan Jackson-Saw. Today we are here speaking with Garam Bari Jakamara. Now we're talking to a member of the original Sovereign Tribal Federation, known as the OSTF.
OSTF. I'm the conveners of the OSTF. The OSTF is the original Sovereign Tribal Federation. And the reason that the OSTF was founded was that in 2007 I was seconded, or rather I was summoned out to the Central Desert. And I went out and I sat with more people out there and I put a bunch of information before them. As they asked me questions, I answered their questions. They told me what they wanted me to do and I went and did that. As a result of that, the OSTF came about, which is an entirely non-government. It is non-Australian. It has nothing to do with Australia. We are a standalone tribal body that has only bloodline-connected people to countries sitting at the table making representations on behalf of their people. We do not interface with the Crown. We do not interface with the UN, other than we went to the UN in 2012 and berated them, for example, for whinging about the Buddhas of Banyama that were blown up in Afghanistan, but would not say anything about, for example, every day the destruction that's going on here, like as the reason you contacted me, Jackie Kunda. For example, what happened in Western Australia last year with a 46,000-year-old museum full of artefacts and art and history that was destroyed because the Australian government, like the rest of the pus buckets around the planet, do not want people to reconnect to the original source. They do not want people to reconnect back to the original bloodlines. They don't want the original knowledge out there.
It seems that the Jaki Kundi, they seem to be in breach of the Queensland Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act 2003, which basically says that they should be able to look after their own lands. Destroying archaeological evidence is one of the major things they've done, but also they've attacked people with police dogs. They've kept them off from engaging in their traditions. The Bunya Festival, for one, back in 2007, they blocked them from going in. I really want to get into native title. Sorry, got him. Yeah.
Sorry, mate. You've really got to look at the nature of the people that are behind it. You have to look at the nature of the people that are behind this. The Premier, who is not doing what she is supposed to do to protect this. She's too busy at this point in time focusing on her position in conflict of interest, where she is mandating people donate their DNA via forced vaccination, via forced testing, et cetera, et cetera. All of that data is going back to Father's company, which holds DNA data, and that data then becomes valuable to them. She is acting in a complete conflict of interest, and the stupid mole should be removed from office because of the simple fact that she has not declared the conflict of interest between herself and her family at Father's company, and the fact that her decisions in relation to the mandatory vaccines are directly feeding millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of personal DNA data to her father's company. Nothing's been said, but she's happy to protect that and sit in office to protect her father. She will do nothing to protect the sacred places on this continent, particularly Queensland. She is typical of what is wrong with politics in Australia today.
Well, that's a
number of pedophiles that sit in the federal parliament and the state parliaments.
I want to ask, because you're quite knowledledgeable on Australian law, very knowledgeable about. You've spoken to the United Nations. You've been fighting for a long time.
I spoke at the United Nations.
I actually want to ask how did that go? The United Nations address. And that for our listeners, that was back in 2012.
Yes, it was good for us. It wasn't much good for them. The whole purpose of us appearing at the United Nations was not to appear to support the United Nations, because we weren't. We went there to ask them questions as to why they're being so why they're being so hypocritical. Why are they standing there saying that they're there to protect people when in actual fact the thing they're doing is destroying people? We asked them, why is it, for example, why is it? They said nothing about the destruction of our sacred sites, the oldest sites on the planet. Like, for example, mid-last century, there was a site at Mullumbimby that was destroyed that was identified as being the oldest known place of worship on the planet, dating back to pre-Paleolithic era. Now, why are they destroying all of our connections to what's out there, what's out in the sky, why are they trying to destroy all of our connections? Why are they trying to destroy all of our connections to countries? Why are they trying to do everything they can, like this Josephine Cashman, this Crown prosecutor, who is apparently being paid by her Crown masters to do nothing but destroy members of the public? Now, since when has that been a prerogative of an employed public servant being paid by the taxpayer to do things like this? What is going on in this country?
Well, I wouldn't.
Why are they trying to destroy the people telling the truth?
I wouldn't call them public servants anymore because they don't seem to be serving the public. They seem to be serving themselves, special interest groups, and the United Nations over the Australian people.
It's absolutely accurate.
I had a quick question. I really want to get your opinion on basically native title in Australia and how it's being used to subvert the authority of the original Australians, because there's a lot of discussion about this issue at the moment.
Okay. Can we get one thing clear?
Sure.
We are not original Australians. Okay. We are not Australians. Okay. We are not first Australians. We're not native Australians. We are tribal people. I'm Gulgazataru. There are Chinese Australians, Mexican Australians, British Australians, Italian Australians. They all are a class of Australian citizen. We are not anything Australian. We are tribe. We are the sovereigns. We are the legitimate sovereigns of this country. Regardless of what people think, they're all entitled to their opinion, but opinion isn't fact necessarily. The fact is that we are the sovereigns here. And because we hold title over the land, the Crown has had to come up with a way whereby they could launder the land to themselves. And this was particularly realised in about the early 70s by the Australian governments. Now, what they've done since then is they've put in place a bunch of frauds. And the major frauds they've done to try and launder the land from the tribal owners to the Crown is a thing called native title. Now, when you talk about native title, given that it's a legal process and a legal concept, we have to use the words that we use in their legal meaning, in their legal context. So when you talk about native title, let's have a look at a few of the words associated with native title. Native itself comes from the Latin word nativus, meaning someone born in the condition of slavery or servitude. So a native is a slave. Then we have a look at the word traditional owner. The word traditional comes from the Latin traditio, meaning someone who has dealt with or sold their title to their land, their interest in it. So a traditional owner is someone who has divested their land. And then we have a look at this thing, prescribed body corporate. Now, every other company on this continent is registered through the Register of Corporations, either state or federally. But all native title representative bodies are registered as prescribed body corporates. Now, the reason they're prescribed is this. In order to claim native title, you have to first admit or stand in the capacity of being an Indigenous Australian. The word Indigenous coming from the Latin indigena, meaning a naturalised citizen of the realm. Now, we proved this in the federal court in Adelaide in 2012 with Justice Mansfield sitting on the bench, when the sovereign Remindry tribe made an application for native title. And the Crown argued that given that the Remindry were in fact a sovereign tribe, they were not allowed to avail themselves of the native title legislation or process because they were not Australian citizens. They were not subjects of the Crown. Okay? Yeah. So the only people who can play this slaves title game, native title, are the people that are in fact Aboriginal Australians. Now, no Aboriginal Australian, and people are going to take this the wrong way, but they've just got to listen to the words and get it clear in their head. No Aboriginal Australian, same as no Mexican Australian, no Chinese Australian, no Italian Australian, no British Australian can speak for or divest the lands of the tribes. Okay? Now, I have the capacity because in 1967 they changed the referendum and gave me the option to become an Australian citizen. By taking up Australian citizenship, I did not abrogate my tribal status. Now, this is being determined by the High Court, most principally in the case of Barnaby, born with New Zealand citizenship. Well, he never used it, regardless of the fact he was born with that birthright. And the birthright stayed with him until he specifically renounces it. Now, given that that applies to all classes of Australians, then Aboriginal Australians, and applies to us too. So as an Aboriginal Australian, I maintain without question, unless I specifically announce it, my tribal sovereign rights, because they are my birthright. Yeah? Now, these are the sorts of things that the Crown doesn't want people to know, particularly not blackfellas. They particularly don't want us to know that we still own this place. They certainly don't want us to know, for example, that when Australians buy a lot in a DP, all the location and title in a deposited plan, they're buying a mark on a map. They're buying the lot in the deposited plan. Now, that lot in the deposited plan is a mark on the map. It's got nothing to do with the land. That's why Australians are called landholders and not landowners. And the reason that the Crown in New South Wales, for example, is currently trying to skull drag back all of their written titles is because their written titles are evidence of their fraudulent misrepresentation of the fact that they took sovereignty over our estates.
Just for the listeners at home, that's are you talking about the dissolving of all paper land titles and basically turning it into an electronic? So it's no longer going to be on paper and not recognised.
Yep, and at the push of a button, they can delete those titles and say, well, sorry, no, it didn't exist. The fact is this. When the Treaty of Westphalia was created in Europe, the European nations agreed that they would never come here and usurp the sovereignty of the tribal people here. They knew this as the great southern land of the Holy Spirit, because this is where all mankind emanates from, okay? When they... sorry, something just flashed up on my screen. It took me mind of it. But the Treaty of Westphalia precluded them from taking sovereignty over this continent. That's why the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, they all came here and traded with us, but never attempted to take sovereignty, okay? Because they knew it wasn't their place. It's only the belligerent Anglo-Saxon British and their superiority complex decided that they were the ones who had a right, despite their treaty with others, despite them entering an agreement. They believed they didn't have to want to become British. They're Anglo-Saxon. They're the best on the planet. They thought they'd come here and steal.
That's a history that people just don't know about. It's like before the basically the colonizers arrived here, the people had already trade set up with the Dutch, even some with the Spanish as well. People came here and
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Even the Egyptians came here for the gold to give to Cleopatra. Now, what is interesting is that regardless of whether or not people want to acknowledge this, it's historic fact. Now, when the British arrived here, when Arthur Phillip stuck his toe in the sand to walk up the beach, he immediately subjected himself to the law of the tribes. End of story. He then walked up the beach and committed a criminal act by putting a rag on a stick in the ground and claiming the land for his king. The problem with that is the law that he had subjected himself to meant that was a criminal act. Because under the law that he had subjected him to, the law of the land, the law of the tribes, the only way you can hold title over the land is if you have a bloodline connection to it. And I'm afraid he didn't have one, and neither does his king. Now, funny how the parliaments of the Commonwealth of Australia and the states and territories all sit there and boldly claim that when Arthur Phillip stuck the rag on the stick in the ground, that's when they took radical title and sovereignty. So let's just have a look at that claim. And just a couple of little things. For example, the entry into the Judge Advocate General's of the First Fleet, Captain David Collins' journal in July 1796, so 8 years after they claimed they took radical title and sovereignty. It states how he just had a lengthy conversation with Bennelong, and Bennelong explained to him how the tribal people at that stage maintained their hereditary title. How's that possible if they took radical title and sovereignty? Then we move forward about 45 years or so, and we come to 1836. Now, in 1836, on the 23rd of February 1836, King William IV issued the letters patent to establish the province of South Australia. Now, it's interesting to suggest that if they took radical title and sovereignty over the whole of the continent, he'd be attempting to set up a province. But let's not go too deep into the facts. Let's not look too closely at the obvious detail. But in the letters patent, second last paragraph of the letters patent, he states that the settlers were not to interfere with the native people's peaceful enjoyment of their own estates. Now, how could they be their own estates if they'd taken radical title and sovereignty over the continent 50 years before? And then we have in 1872, we have an act called the Pacific Island Protection Act that was created. And a lot of people argue, some of the lesser intelligent academics in this country would argue that It doesn't apply in Australia, as I've had argued to me on numerous occasions. But I point them to Section 2 of the Act that states that where it uses the term other places in the Act, it's referring to the Australasian colonies, which includes this here. Now, in 1875, Queen Victoria amended the Act by way of an order in council, and Section 6 of the amendment stated very clearly that the only jurisdiction they could have here was over British subjects. And in Section 7, under the title Rights of the Tribes, it was stated, quote, that they were not allowed to extend or construe to extend sovereignty or dominion into the Pacific Islands and other places, being the Australasian colonies, and as such, sovereignty and dominion was to remain with the chiefs and the rulers and the peoples of the tribes. Now, if we then tie that together with a set of rules called Halsbury's Rules, which govern the operation of the Westminster Parliaments, and we look at the contemporaneous version for that period, which is edition 3, and if you go to page 337, paragraph 559, part 12 and 12.1, part 12 says that they were not allowed to usurp the sovereignty of any other people, and no other people was allowed to usurp the sovereignty of the British. For example, it says that the Maori assembled in Parliament at Waitangi. Now, Section 12.1 says that if you amend any British statute, you can only amend it to strengthen and give more strength to the original intent of the Act. So if we have a look at the Constitution when it was written, we move forward 25 years from 1875 to 1900. The Constitution stated at Section 51.26 that they could not make laws for people of the Aboriginal race. That was to conform with Section 6 of the amendment to the Act, the Pacific Island Protection Act, where it said that they could not, their jurisdiction only extended to their own people. And if we look at Section 127 of the Constitution, it said that they could not count us as part of the population of the Commonwealth or any part thereof, any state or territory. The reason, again, we were sovereigns. We were outside their jurisdiction. We were over and above it. They could not count us because they had no authority to do so. Now, in 1967, the Australian citizens who were subject to that law decided to amend it, and they removed the section that said they couldn't make laws for people of the Aboriginal race, and they removed the section that said they couldn't count us as part of their population. But they never replaced those negative averments that were removed with positive statements saying they could count us and they could make laws for us. Why? Because they never obtained our consent to do so. That's right. So in 1967, we were given the option to become Australian citizens. It did not remove from us our tribal status and our sovereign status, okay? As I said, that was established by the High Court in Barnaby Joyce's case. Our birthright is our birthright. They can't take it from us. So to the government. Now, what happened is that after 1967, in 1970, Australia and the UK assented to UN Resolution 262525. It was 24th of October 1970. That resolution is called the Decolonisation Resolution and instructs all of the colonising countries that they are to decolonise and set the original peoples free. They are to decolonise. Now, when Britain decolonises, to decolonise doesn't mean you just change the name on a few things and everything goes forward as it is. To decolonise means to decolonise. In other words, the colonisers remove themselves from authority and power, and the sovereigns step back in, the legitimate sovereigns step back in. Now, the interesting thing about Australia is we don't have a treaty with any of the governments here. Okay, there is no treaty. There never has been. As Don Howard says, there won't be one on his watch. Thank goodness for that. Right? Now, given that there's no treaty, we are not bound to them. The only treaty that the OSTF members are bound to is the OSTF Treaty, which says that as tribal peoples, we recognise each other. We see each other as being sovereigns, joint and several sovereigns on this continent. We acknowledge each other's song, dance, ceremony, law, country, bloodline, the whole books and dice. And we extend to each other a modern day right to traverse each other's country freely without the need to seek permission other than in respect of sacred and significant sites, initiation grounds, all that sort of stuff, which are reserved exclusively for the bloodline people of the country, which is fair and reasonable. That was what the OSTF agreed to. That's what the law people who established OSTF and the senior people that established OSTF in 2010, that's what was agreed to. And this was all done under instruction from Central Desert law people. And others from around the country. There were people from Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australia, blah, blah, blah.
I don't seem to be
anyway, the issue with the government is this. Sorry?
They don't seem to be respecting that at all, especially recently with the Binjari as well. They just went through and just took them all out of their homes and put them in a camp off their own land.
But talk, if you talk to the black academic that's up there running the Aboriginal corporation, she'll tell you it was a load of misinformation. You know, those 3 little boys that were taken from Binjari and put in the detention centre and escaped, that's just a figment of our imagination, according to her. You know, the fact that people were being forcibly jabbed is just a figment of our imagination, despite the fact that we got phone calls and videos sent to us, etc., etc. But don't worry about that; it doesn't matter.
So you did find
that's what happens when you.
So just to be clear, you found evidence, and you've got video evidence that people were actually forcibly jabbed there.
I don't have it personally, and there are a couple of people who have been rung that people have taken footage on things other than mobile cameras, because mobile cameras at the time they had set up their little the government. That when the pigs walked in there, they set up their little black box so you can't transmit or use your mobile phones. Yeah. So, we won't go into what format it's in, but we're going to set a few people up, and this information will come out publicly once those people have cried that it doesn't exist. Okay? It's the best way to do things. If we just say it, it means nothing. If we say it and they deny it, we then prove that they're liars. That means something. Okay. A lot of people just don't get how we play the game yet. Now, when the in 2010, when we created the OSTF, the first order of business was we sent a notice to the Crown, and by Crown I mean the Queen and those beneath her, the Governor General, those beneath them, the governors and the premiers and the Prime Minister. Incidentally, there's no such thing as a Prime Minister in Australia.
So just to qualify, you said there's no such thing as a Prime Minister in Australia. Just to be clear, what did you mean there's no Prime Minister in Australia?
Sorry?
You just said that there's no such thing as Prime Minister in Australia. What do you mean by that?
No. Well, all of the executive officers of the Parliament are listed in the Constitution, are they not? Yeah. Well, fucking pick up the Constitution and find Prime Minister.
Interesting. I've never heard this point of view.
If you've got a copy of the Constitution on your computer, it's really easy. Open it in Word and go to Find and type in Prime or Minister or Prime Minister and see if you can find Prime Minister.
Well, I haven't seen that before, so I guess it's not there.
Yeah. Now the reason it's not there, and this is very, very telling about how fraudulent and misrepresentative and scandalous and scumbag like these politicians have been since they got. The reason they put the Prime Minister over the Parliament or between the Parliament is to divide and conquer. They could not have a division, that is, two parties. They didn't have something to stand in the middle. And that's what the Prime Minister is all about. Okay? How can anything that's been done under any Prime Minister be legitimate? We've got to look at things like this. Every member of every political party that sits in the parliaments of this country are in breach of Section 28 of the Crimes Act. Every single one of them. Not to mention that none of them have actually filed a Form 415B, which is another thing, which means they can't sit in the parliament anyway, but that's another story. There's only one politician in this country that's filed one, and that's Craig Kelly. Okay? No, it's Craig Kelly or Lord Cullerton. I think it might be Lord Cullerton. I'm not correct on that. I get them two confused for some reason. Anyway, the Constitution says that Section 28 of the Crimes Act says that anybody who interferes with another person's political liberty is guilty of a crime and the penalty is 3 years imprisonment. Now, let's just look at the Labor Party. When the caucus tells the Labor Party members of the House of Representatives how to vote in the House, They are interfering with the political liberty of the constituents of that member. Now, the reason it was called the House of Representatives, surprisingly enough, is it was supposed to be a House of Representatives of the representatives of constituents, not political parties.
Right.
Yeah? That's why we don't need a Prime Minister. We don't need a Prime Minister because the head of state is supposed to be the Governor-General, and the lower house was supposed to enter bills as advised by constituents through their elected member, enter this into the House, bring this bill to the House, and let's see if we can't get a law created around this. Now, when that bill goes to the House, it gets discussed. It either goes up to the Senate or it doesn't. When it gets to the Senate, it then gets reviewed and the checks and balances are put in place. And then after that, it goes to the Governor-General, right? And then technically it's supposed to go to the Queen for royal assent. Now, the reason we don't need a Prime Minister is because there is no place in the House for a Prime Minister. The only reason they want a Prime Minister is because it denotes a division in the House. There is not meant to be a division in the House. The House is meant to be the House. It's a House of Representatives. It's not a House of arguments. It's not a House of two parties. It's not a House of division. It's a House of Representatives. Each one of those representatives is supposed to represent their constituents and their constituents only. They are not allowed to collude to amend the vote in the House because that goes against the will of their constituents. Their constituents want them to vote in accord with their constituents' voice, not in accord with some pedophile Prime Minister who wants to take another pedophile to dinner with the President of the United States, for example.
So you're saying that we shouldn't have a situation where you have one party on one side of the floor and you have another party on the other side of the floor, and between them is a couple of independents. What you're saying is that it should be basically one party system of all individual members who all vote on their conscience. Is that what I'm saying?
Yep, exactly right. That's what it says. That's what it's called, a House of Representatives. There is no Prime Minister legally. There is no Prime Minister. When are Australians going to fucking wake up to what's going on here? You know, we currently have a person pretending to be a Prime Minister. And I say pretending because there is no such office. Okay, and here's the stupidity. We now have a Prime Minister who purports to install the vice-regal officer, the Governor-General. Now, the Governor-General installs the Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister installs the Governor-General. Who has the power here? And where's the Queen in amongst all this?